Hi, I'm Greg Lindsay, Director of Applied Research at New Cities, and welcome to the all-new, all-different Big Rethink. If you've been joining us the past few months, you know that New Cities has held a series of webinars dealing with how the post-COVID environment has impacted cities. But we realize that you have so many webinars to choose from. There's a webinar seemingly every hour of the day. And so rather than force you to be co-synchronous with us, we've decided to relaunch the Big Rethink as a special sort of video podcast, a webcast, if you will, where we're going to basically bring to you the news of the week with a special guest and really sort of get into a quick 30-minute discussion that will tell you everything you need to know about the current state of cities. Well, maybe not everything, but at least the most important things. And so welcome to our first episode of this new format. I'm going to launch us off here with basically sort of a bit of a presentation, walk you through some slides, recap the news and what I'm thinking about, and then we'll be joined in the second half by our first special guest, Mike Bloomberg. No, not that Mike Bloomberg, the good one. Mike Bloomberg, who is the Chief of Staff to Mayor Alex Morse of Holyoke, Massachusetts. Alex Morse, if you know the name, of course, was once the youngest mayor in America. Now he's just another third-term mayor at the age of 30 who's primarying one of the longest-serving congressmen in the Democratic primary, just coming up here in a few weeks. And so we're going to hear from Mike in a bit about really sort of their hurricane response to Hurricane Maria, which, if you recall, Hurricane Maria was a hurricane that struck Puerto Rico, but had long-standing impacts on Holyoke, Massachusetts, as well as his guiding of their COVID response in the early weeks of March 2020. But we'll hear from him in a bit. I'm going to go into my caffeinated presentation right now, so let me just share my screen, and we will get started here. Come on, there we go. All right, the Big Rethink, where to begin this week? Let's start with Hurricane Isaias, Category 1, the 9th named storm of 2020, the earliest we've ever reached a named storm this early in the hurricane season. Hurricane Isaias only reached Category 1, made landfall and went up the US East Coast. It's now past Canada there, but really sort of underscores exactly the kind of dynamic that we're looking at going into the fall, in which a major hurricane could strike several key states during the United States presidential elections during a time, of course, a global pandemic where Florida has sort of become the epicenter of the entire pandemic there. But this is also takes place against the backdrop of increasing realizations, right, about flooding and long-term climate use. And I bring this up because, of course, New Cities, we're working on a new event for this fall and winter called Higher Ground. It's going to look at climate migration and managed retreat. This is a report coming out from NOAA just a few weeks ago here, and about basically that coastal flooding will be larger and penetrate further inland than anyone had previously anticipated. There's yet another report here about basically how new rising seas projections could threaten millions beyond immediate shorelines, similar effects around the world. This is a headline that comes out of Fortune magazine, 20% of the global economy by 2100. You can see the top line is, the top image is the baseline projection of global flooding, while the bottom half of that image shows how things could get much, much worse, not only, of course, across the United States East Coast, but throughout the Caribbean and especially in the Pacific Rim. So that is a major threat. And already, we have in Bangladesh, a quarter of Bangladesh is already underwater, presaging the long predicted, perhaps, mass migration out, of course, the Indian subcontinent prompted by climate change. So, the New Republic recently touted this about perhaps we're now living in an era of back-to-back crises that just simply roll into another, the pandemic that rolls into climate change, that rolls into storms, and so forth and so forth. So that's something to think about. And while we're also thinking about, of course, the global poor and the global south, new studies coming out of Mumbai show that, that basically antibody rates in Dharavi, the world's, most infamous slum made famous by Slumdog Millionaire, is showing infection rates somewhere above 60%. Now, this to me is very interesting because as a former resident of Jackson Heights, Queens, which of course was the epicenter of New York, this is the similar infection rate. And what those two things have in common, of course, is not just, very large South Asian populations in both neighborhoods, but also, of course, overcrowded housing, non-ventilated spaces, all of the things that we've now learned contribute, of course, to the pandemic. So if there's one thing we've learned here is about how, basically the informal housing in whether it's in New York City or whether it's in Mumbai is, of course, a major contributor to the pandemic. Now, meanwhile, off in the suburban lifestyle dream, we had the President of the United States roll back, of course, Obama-era rules that would enforce more fair housing. The president, gleefully rolled it back with a naked appeal to his white suburban voter base enjoy, as he left it there. But of course, this is happening at a time where the president's poll numbers are slumping massively, even as the stock markets continue to climb upwards with no end in sight. And we can sort of see this continued softness in the suburbs just recently in the Missouri primaries, where Cori Bush, a Black Lives Matter organizer who was radicalized in the wake of the Ferguson protests and then riots in 2014, won her challenge against a 10-term Democratic congressman who inherited the seat from his father. And what's interesting about Cori Bush is not only is she a left-wing progressive candidate endorsed by the Democratic Socialists of America, is that she overwhelmingly won the suburbs against him. And at the same time that that happened, well, she didn't overwhelmingly, but she won enough suburban voters over to win that seat. And at the same time, in Missouri, of course, was a ballot measure to expand Medicaid. And this sort of shows you the geographic breakdown. And what's really interesting about this is that, this shows major gains, not just against 2016 in the Hillary Clinton presidential election, but also in 2018 for big votes to expand Medicaid there. So you might expect that, of course, that, St. Louis County and core counties around Kansas City would, of course, support it. But really, St. Charles County flipping over to vote in favor of Medicaid expansion shows how basically sort of suburban voters are turning away from the president and turning away from the Republican Party in favor of this progressive wave. And I thought of this, MSNBC host Chris Hayes points out here that yes, the suburbs are becoming, the tipping point for endorsing these kinds of progressive measures going forward. So it'll be very interesting to sort of see how this ties into continued urban dynamics. Now, while we're talking about the suburbs, I want to mention here, of course, is that people are still waiting to see proven out the conventional wisdom that cities are over and that we're going to see mass flight to the suburbs. This is from Apartment List endorsed by Joe Courtwright of City Observatory. Joe, of course, is a major supporter of urban density. But according to Apartment List searches here, you can see, and this is backed up by what Zillow is seeing as well, that white people are unhappy with their current living arrangements and are actively out there searching for a different city or a different metro or a different state even. We're not seeing, this sort of wholesale fleeing from the higher density counties of various cities. So that remains to be seen. But what is happening in the suburbs? Well, one thing we're seeing, of course, is as city after city in the United States basically cancels in-person instruction. First, Los Angeles, of course. Chicago is one of the latest. The entire sort of eastern seaboard through Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland have all basically canceled in-person instruction. We're now seeing really wealthy parents turn to the possible alternatives. And this is a New York Times story here highlighting $125,000 a year pod schools. And also in the lower right there, you see Jason Calacanis, the venture capitalist who wanted to run for mayor of San Francisco, basically openly pulling his children out of public school, trying to basically headhunt public school teachers and then offer scholarships. To which someone else pointed out on Twitter, can you imagine the spectacle of VC sitting on couches interviewing parents about why their children should get scholarships to their micro school, as he calls it. So we can start to see, these wealthy suburbanites and others start to exit these public goods. A very worrisome trend, to say the least, but one, of course, that's couched in the language of wanting to do what's best for their children in light of school closures. And I bring this up, one of my other hobby horses, which you're going to learn a lot about in the course of these podcasts, is also sort of where the future goes in terms of work from home and this notion that the office is over along with cities. This is some statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics here showing that, that less than a third of Americans have been able to really work from home and telecommute during the crisis. And as you might expect here, of course, that, it's more likely to be young than old, that, of course, it's highly striated by income and job type. If you look at the bottom there, that basically professional professions, financial operations, et cetera. Well, of course, there's a huge swath of working class and blue collar people who have no option to telework. So it'll be very interesting to see how this continues to stray out in terms of inequality. And, we have some evidence here from Toronto, for example. This has been making the rounds as well. What you're seeing is that when lockdown orders started, white collar workers who could telework immediately flattened the curve. That's them on the bottom of the graph. While essential workers, at least their jobs are essential, the workers are not so much, they of course saw big spikes in COVID infection rate. So we now have the data coming in here to show how basically working class essential workers were sacrificed in terms of their health to ensure that working from home and lockdown would continue to be effective. And this is against the backdrop as well as we've seen, in New York, in white collar neighborhoods like my old neighborhood here, Smith Street in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, where Mayor Bill de Blasio has allowed curbside restaurant seating to become permanent. We'll see how deep it goes into the fall season, but they've sort of ratified the notion that this will carry forward. And this, of course, if you follow our mobility sister over at Commotion, we just had a webinar on this. But at the same time that's happening, the statistics are coming in to show that almost a third of New York small businesses may be gone forever. Based on Yelp data, they've seen over 2,800 small businesses close as landlords, of course, continue to not offer really sort of rent abatement on this. And why we're seeing this huge amount of retail and business diversity wiped out that, of course, overwhelmingly afflicts businesses of color and other marginalized communities. So, there's, at the same time that we're celebrating, dining outdoors, we're seeing incredible damage to the urban fabric of American cities. And not to weigh too much on New York, but I wanted to flag this, that the Regional Plan Association, which is a coalition of business interests that sort of proposes long-term planning for New York, put together some fairly sensible measures about imagining how people would commute back, even as, capacity is stripped from the system, whether it's expanding bike routes to rethinking, and turning increasingly number of streets over to transit corridors, but trying to think about how it would get people back into the city, which, as we know at the moment, those office towers in Midtown are fairly deserted. So it'll be interesting to see how they bring that to heel. But that is expected to return, because one of the big news items of the past week, particularly championed by proponents of density in cities, is the news that Facebook, one of the biggest proponents of work from home, has at the same time signed a 750,000 square foot lease inside the Farley post office building across the street from Penn Station. So, Facebook placing a massive bet that it will return to the city, with, thousands of workers. I think I've seen estimates of up to 4,000 workers could work in that building. And this is happening on a big new tech corridor where Google and others are just down the street going into Hudson Yards. Now, that's interesting to me because at the same time, there's some really interesting data coming from Indeed, the job hunting site, to show that technology companies are actually faring worse than the overall economy. Now, this is from an employment perspective, which is a very interesting counter narrative, of course, to the stock market narrative that shows that the FANGs or the stacks, whatever you want to call them, are some of the biggest beneficiaries of this. So you can sort of see here that tech jobs have been much more slow to recover. You can see that that interestingly enough, that non-tech hubs have actually suffered even more. So this idea that that there's a max exodus or mass layoffs in places like San Francisco or New York or Seattle is actually not true. Here's the various categories as they suffer, and you can sort of see it's been a mixed bag for some of the tech hubs there, where actually they have seen even more decline in technology jobs than in sort of regular posts. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how this shakes out. And and I have my own theories on this. I just published a brief essay arguing here that that Facebook's work from home policy, where they decided that they would allow you to work from anywhere, but they would actually tie your salary to local cost of living, is actually perhaps a much larger play here about thinking about where the next pool of cheap labor goes. This is not about actually quality of life or giving this to amenity, but really a sort of epic arbitrage, and one that's prompted in part by the fact that the Trump administration is moving to close off the H-1B visa, which would choke off about 65 to 80,000 jobs in technology of workers who are highly skilled, of course, but have little recourse when it comes to salary and rights in their workplace. So remains to be seen about whether that that Facebook and others, seeing the end of this geographic arbitrage in a global sense, is now moving to one in sort of national standards. And and I won't belabor it too much for right now, but it's been interesting. There's been some essays floating around now about thinking about what the future of employment looks like, because I believe, and would argue with all of you all day on this, that that if work from home continues, we're going to start to see the end of conventional employment as we know it. We've seen the rise of these work platforms, Upwork being perhaps the most common, but this is a whole list of all the very specialist platforms where basically we could see gig work be applied to white-collar knowledge workers, where we'll see a decline in sort of permanent employment and an increasing number of people who will be employed at will on a project-by-project basis from wherever they happen to be in the country. Needless to say, based on what we've seen in the gig work, and based on what we've seen from states like California trying desperately to regulate that Uber and Lyft drivers, for example, are actual full-time employees, I don't think this has been a good bet for workers in general, and I'm not inclined to think that it's going to work out so well for white-collar workers either. Now, I'm almost finished with this, but I want 2 more points on this. This is being taped, of course, against the backdrop of CARES Act benefits expiring, the $600 a week. Benefits have been made to to U.S. workers. So not only are we expecting an evictions cliff where 10 or 20 or as many as 30 million Americans could be subject to possible evictions, there's also a piece coming out here where, yes, cities are finding themselves unable to build more affordable housing due to their own fiscal crisis and the lack of other sort of developers refusing to invest, a lack of federal subsidies, et cetera. Something that I hope my guest Mike Bloomberg will talk a bit about. And then finally, to leave things on an optimistic note before we bring on our guest here, Bloomberg published a piece noting that as if things weren't bad enough, annual U.S. birth rates continue to decline. And I must say I'm not very surprised by this, because I've been working for over a year on a forthcoming report on the millennial generation, who are entering what should be their peak childbearing years. And due to the combination of two fiscal crises in their adult lifetimes, and due to the fact of how they've been saddled with student debt, unable to buy homes, and really have the trappings of a middle-class lifestyle, have simply chosen to defer and defer and defer their childbearing years, which of course has implications because a significant fraction of them simply won't ever have childbearing years. So these are the stakes, and this is what we're up against in the United States. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite on our guest, Mike Bloomberg. So come on out, Mike. There we are. What a great setup for you. So much bleakness for you to deal with.
Honestly, I'm wondering how much my mother paid you to talk about millennials who are in student debt, who are reaching childbearing years, who have yet to have kids. So I hope this is not a trap to get me into talking about that.
I'm glad we can send this to Mrs. Bloomberg. But before we get into that, I want to start with some of the topical issues on this one. I mean, I teased at the very top of this, and I want to talk about this a bit. Hurricane Isaias, the beginning really of the new hurricane season, which I forgot to mention, experts are predicting this could be the quote unquote busiest hurricane season in the Atlantic since 2005, which is the year of Katrina. So, Puerto Rico, of course, devastated by Maria in 2017. Florida's had major strikes. And, Maria triggered a mass diaspora out of Puerto Rico, many to Florida, as you might expect, but many others on a per capita basis to Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is not anywhere near the coast, I should add. So how did Holyoke become a major hurricane diaspora magnet, and what can it teach other cities about the fact that, very soon climate migrants and even climate refugees will soon be on your doorstep?
So the city of Holyoke, it's about 40,000 people. We're up here in Western Massachusetts. It was the first planned industrial city in the country. And so back in the early 1800s, you had these wealthy mill owners in Lowell and the Boston area, the Boston Consortium, who were recognizing the power of hydropower when it came to manufacturing. Their original thoughts were textile mills. And they found this spot in Western Massachusetts with a 53-foot natural drop in the Connecticut River. And they said, let's bring immigrants out there and force them to dig some canals. And then we'll force them to work in these mills and these factories. And really, the city was founded upon the backs of those immigrant workers. And it transitioned, pretty early on, it was Irish workers, which transitioned to French Canadian workers. And that was because the French Canadians weren't threatening to unionize. And then you had Polish immigrants. And by the 50s, there were some alterations in federal law, which made it easier for people living on the island of Puerto Rico to come to the mainland United States. And due to the fertile soil area around the Pioneer Valley of which Holyoke sits, and due to the cheap housing afforded by what was once factory worker housing in the city of Holyoke, we saw an influx of people moving from Puerto Rico to the city of Holyoke. Today, 46% of the city is people who identify as being from Puerto Rico, and a little over 50% is Hispanic and Latino in the city of Holyoke. And so we had the largest concentration of people outside the island of Puerto Rico. So when Maria hit, we had, you can see my eyes, 2,200 and change, 2,200 plus people come up from Puerto Rico to either come here full time or at least just shelter with family and friends, or at least knowing that there was a support network here for them.
Wow. And what's for context, what's the total population of Holyoke?
40,000.
Okay.
40,000. So 2,200 people come really in the matter of about 2 weeks.
So a 5% population increase almost overnight.
Almost overnight. And these are not people who are leaving Manhattan to their Hamptons home, right? This is people who we just released the report last week. So early on, right as Maria hit, the state and the city discussed, hey, how are we going to address this? And shouldn't we really measure and monitor our response to this because of what you just mentioned. This is not going to be the first time that this happens, whether it's Holyoke in Puerto Rico, or another city and another island, or a mainland community in the United States. This is going to happen over and over again. And so what can we learn from these responses? And yeah, over 2,200 people coming in. These are people who needed housing. They had children who needed to get into the schools. Many of them not speaking English and needing access to Spanish language classes and assistance, clothing, food, housing, all across the board. And unfortunately, it's a trend that we're expecting continues.
Interesting. Well, I would say I will make sure that readers, listeners, viewers can download the report afterwards. But like, what's your top line recommendations to other cities? And how many of those 2,200 have stayed? How many did you successfully integrate into the community versus them moving on?
I will have to check how many fully stayed here, but the responses were overwhelmingly positive from the residents that came in. And while the city got good marks as being available and at the forefront, and the state as well, the real shining example of this report was the local cultural institutions, these deeply ingrained cultural institutions that have been in the city really since the 60s and 70s. A woman named Betty Medina, who has been fighting in the city since the late 1960s, early 1970s, and built an organization, La Fe de Familias, which has been an advocate for people displaced by, we had a roof collapse on a building from a storm maybe 2 months ago, and we had 34 residents from one building displaced. And who's there day one is Betty, to make sure that these folks have food and shelter and things of that nature. And so you can have the best city, you can have the best mayor, you can have the best planning director, and you can have a division for this in the state, but there's a deep community fabric that we have here in Holyoke, and every community has it. And how well you leverage that, and how well you recognize, and how well you provide them with resources. From the city side, we knew, that Betty and has the credibility with these families. So sometimes you actually have to step back and say, look, we need to provide resources to the people who can respond to this better than we can.
That's a great lesson for that. Well, in addition to being the chief of staff to Mayor Morse, for a few months, you were also the head of emergency services and really the frontline executive to deal with the COVID crisis. And you were counting some of this on Twitter recently about the moment of realization when no one was coming to save us. We had to save ourselves. Can you walk us through what that was like? Because of course, as we're recording this, cities are about to go off a fiscal cliff as well. Like, the failure of Congress to provide aid to the states and the cities really has them facing the 8 ball. So I'm curious about what it was like in March and what you're staring at and what you're dealing with now.
Yeah, it was late February, and I remember an email coming in from a friend of mine down in Washington, D.C., who said, "What are you doing to prepare for coronavirus?" And I laughed at him. I said, look, I've got this, these 500 other things are far more important to the city of Holyoke than what at the time was something that was just occurring in China. That I haven't heard anything from my Board of Health. I haven't heard anything from the state's Department of Public Health. New York's not doing anything. Boston's not doing anything. Why would little old Holyoke, the second poorest city in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, an hour and a half west of Boston, be preparing for the coronavirus? He called me stupid, and I took that to heart. I said, this is a smart person, and I should probably listen. So I said, tell me why, show me why, and sent me a number of articles and things to read. And within 3 days, we had called an emergency meeting with the Board of Health, the epidemiologist, the lead epidemiologist from an area hospital, members of our area medical community, say, what are we dealing with here? And even at that time, it was like, well, this is what coronavirus is, but we're not sure that it's going to make it out here. We're not sure that's what it's going to look like. But it really level set for everybody. And I remember, you could still see the stains on the table from when I bleached it after that meeting, when we were all starting to get concerned that this was going to be an issue. And sure enough, a few weeks later, things started to come to a standstill. But even at that time, and I think what's really important to note, and you mentioned the lack of state and local resources, for the first 6 weeks of this, especially in we have governors across the country who still haven't acted as if coronavirus is a serious threat. You've had other governors, and I think Ohio is a good example where the response was led by the governor. But in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where our governor has, in the grand scheme of things, done an okay job comparably, but still for the first 6 weeks of this was entirely led by state and local government. The biggest event in Holyoke every year, like this population of 40,000, we have a St. Patrick's Day parade that brings in almost 400,000 people annually. And it is the biggest event that you could possibly think of in this city. And to be faced, with this question and
Cancellation.
Are we going to cancel this? And trying to make sure that nobody comes to burn down City Hall for canceling the St. Patrick's Day parade. And we were asking the state, can you help us here? And they said no. And we went back and said, okay, you don't have to cancel it for us, but at least give us do you have any guidance as to what we should be thinking about, how we should be measuring this question and responding to this. Our director of the Board of Health in Holyoke's primary responsibility is really inspections of apartment units, backyards, side yards, public health response things. He's not a leading epidemiologist, but these are the people who had to immediately become the best experts that we could be when it came to epidemiology and public response and make determinations. And so for the first 6 weeks, whether it was starting with the cancellation of this parade, but we canceled and closed down schools before the state ordered schools. We closed down, we had to come up with regulations for disallowing people in retail establishments and closing the mall, the largest taxpayer in the city. We're one of those cities that still has a thriving mall because all of the other malls in Western Massachusetts have consolidated into ours. But all of these closures and all of these decisions had to be made at the local level. And now here we are, and it's almost the reverse or the other side of this barbell of, okay, we had to make all these decisions on our own for 6 weeks, and then the state came in, and for the 3 months the state has guided a slow reopening period, but now we're seeing an uptick in cases, and schools are supposed to start in 2 weeks. We have our biggest question was, can we pass a budget, right? Cities across, we don't get to print money, so we actually have to pass a budget, and we had to pass a budget by July 1st. We had to pass a budget on July 1st with revenue projections that suggested complete bankruptcy for the city if the state were to not give us the amount of state aid that is expected. And of course, the state doesn't want to pass a budget. They just passed a 3-month stopgap budget because we're all waiting on what the federal government has to say. And the federal government, Mitch McConnell and the Senate, has decided, July 4th vacation was more important than passing state and local aid. And now you've got on the Republican side this question of whether liability waivers are more important than state and local aid, and on the Democratic side, SALT deductions and tax deductions and whether that's a holdup. Meanwhile, if there's a 16% reduction in revenue and aid for local governments, we're done. And so we're trying to tell families, they're being asked to send their children to school. Nothing that we have seen is showing right now that would be safe for more than really a day. And you look at the chart that you showed earlier, and Holyoke sits squarely in the working class people who still have to show up to work. Our largest employers are the retail sales at the mall. It is the Amazon fulfillment center. It is call centers. It is local public health and first responders. These are people who have to go to work no matter what. And they can't go to work if their children are at home. And they have to go to work if they want to put food on their plates and have a roof over their head. So that's a catch-22. And that's what we're struggling to respond to right now, is how are we telling people to send their kids to school and risk that safety so that they can go to work. And this is the challenges. This is why when someone complains, well, you're paying people to stay home, that's exactly what we're trying to do. That's exactly what we have to do if we're going to stop this virus right now.
I have a meta question here. You and I have traveled enough in urbanist circles to know that, there was that moment of like cities triumphalism, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago, where the notion of mayors are the ones best positioned to solve crises. And obviously this crisis has exposed the very hard fiscal limits on mayors and their ability to actually respond to this. What's your one takeaway about this notion of cities and mayors as the atomic governmental unit in the United States and beyond, and the fact that they should be celebrated for that? It strikes me as we've seen a revenge in the last 4 years of the nation state and just how much harm the feds can do, I suppose you could say.
Well, as long as we're the United States of America, what happens in one state is not something that won't bleed over into another. And when it comes to a pandemic, there just aren't these borders. So first and foremost, you could have had the best reaction from a mayor and a city government, and ultimately, because the way our country is set up, and for good reasons, that's not always the best response to a pandemic, or it's not always going to work. But I would poke at that, which is there's been a long-standing, and our friend Richard Flores has certainly written about it on both sides of the coin. First with his first book, and second with a bit of a mea culpa. But I can say certainly from the Holyoke standpoint, that freedom, that excitement that's coming from cities and mayors, it's not spread equally among cities and mayors across the country.
Yeah.
We have been small cities, particularly Rust Belt cities and old New England cities, have become economically disempowered. We are, when our trade policies and our other workforce policies mean that we are essentially a service community. We operate almost entirely off of state and federal subsidies, payments, and organizations. The healthcare industry, we have some of the highest per capita numbers of first responders, police, fire, and things of that nature in our community. And we have an economy that we actually have very little control over. And I think that's different from a New York City or a Boston, where a New York City's response to coronavirus, I don't think they can blame the lack of federal response and the lack of federal support. I think there's a level of action and activities that they can take because of their sheer economic size. And so it really depends on the community in my mind.
All right, well, we could talk all day, but for viewers' sake, one more question on this. Your boss is running for Congress against one of the longest tenured incumbents and most powerful incumbents in the House of Representatives. And Alex Morse has also been endorsed by groups like Justice Democrats, which endorse Cori Bush, and along with the Squad and sort of other progressive wings. I won't ask you to handicap his chances, but I am curious. I talked a bit about the suburbs there. I talked about the base of support. Holyoke is more of a Rust Belt town. But how would you describe his coalition of voters? Like who does he and you believe will vote for him in this upcoming primary in terms of socioeconomically and in terms of race and everything else? Like who is he appealing to versus the base of his opponent?
Yeah, so the first congressional district, we say it's a lot like the country. It's the most rural district in the state. It's 87 cities and towns, and in Massachusetts, that's over a fifth of the landmass of the state. You have old industrial cities like Holyoke, Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the second largest city in the state outside of Boston. You have a cultural and tourism economy out in Berkshire County in the Berkshires. And you have a lot of farmland and agriculture in between. And so this has been built into the message of the mayor's campaign and really a reflection of what we've been trying to do in Holyoke, which is change this narrative of this being about left versus lefter, Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus progressive, and just talk about look at what's happened to our district. Just go back to the exact same thing that was talked about, economic disempowerment. And we continue to say that, look, the way in which Alex can win this race, but the way in which we need to really govern and be represented in Congress is by recognizing that these people who are your neighbors in your community, who you argue over for most of these issues and point fingers at and blame for most of these issues, they're not the problem. right? Look around the community. No, stop measuring yourself to your neighbor and start measuring yourself to the 30 years of history that we've had with our current congressman, where we have been disempowered. And I think that shakes out to the entire country. And I think that's what we saw last night in St. Louis with Cori Bush. It's what we saw in the Bronx with Jamal Bowman. And hopefully we can continue to see is this new generation of politicians, which is saying, stop fighting with your neighbor and start working together in solidarity to say that this is what we need to do to take our country back from large corporate interests and start representing people again.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, Mike, as our first guest on the all new, all different Big Rethink.
Always happy to chat, Greg. Thanks.
Well, and viewers, thank you so much for joining us. This is our inaugural episode of this, so I hope you've enjoyed it. We will be back soon with some refinements and tweaks and hope to make this a regular weekly appearance. So until the very next episode, thank you so much for joining us and take care.